And we'll get it for you. Anybody? Okay. I think everybody got it. Thank you. My name is Tony Payan. I'm the director of the Center for the United States and Mexico here at Rice University's Baker Institute. I want to welcome you to this public lecture. Thank you for coming this morning. I also want to thank our sponsors. You can see here are the companies that have joined the Mexico Forum. We're very grateful to all of them because without them, the functioning, the operations of the Mexico Center would be quite difficult. We need the resources to conduct the kind of research and public conversation that we do. So thank you all for your support. For decades, Mexico has been struggling to figure out the route to strengthen the rule of law throughout the country, particularly on issues such as corruption and crime. The paths taken in the past by many of the country's leaders have been many and varied. They go from open confrontation to the creation of collective bodies that address the issue from a legal standpoint. There is a multiplicity of laws, norms, systems, organizations, and actors all involved in this. And yet, the country has made little to no progress on many indicators related to the rule of law. And on some of them, the country has actually slipped further and further behind. After the meager results so far, there has been recognition that Mexico requires a smarter, more effective strategy and finer tools to advance the rule of law. And here enter Dr. Santiago Nieto Castillo, who took charge of a very little used tool, financial intelligence, followed the route of the money strategy to fight both corruption and crime. He has taken charge of mining and examining the information that is required to deny corrupt government officials and criminals the use of their ill-gotten gains. Dr. Nieto has rebuilt the Financial Intelligence Unit in Mexico's Treasury Department to follow the money and produce the right kind of information to empower the prosecutorial system in Mexico to pursue those who would take from society and deprive it of its resources to grow and prosper. We are thus very happy to continue this conversation on Mexico's rule of law, one that we initiated 7 years ago when the Mexico Center, now the United States, the Center for the United States and Mexico, opened its doors. And it is certainly our pleasure to open this semester here at the Baker Institute by welcoming Dr. Nieto Castillo. Let me read a little bit of his biography, just highlights, because I think it's important. Clearly, the new administration in Mexico is taking a different tack to fighting corruption and crime. And we cannot really underestimate the importance of our guest today in this new strategy. And we're happy to have him here in the first lecture of this academic year. Dr. Santiago Nieto Castillo is the director of the Financial Intelligence Unit, as I said, in Mexico's Secretariat for Finance and Public Credit. Between 2015 and 2017, Dr. Nieto was a federal special prosecutor for electoral offenses. And he became a researcher at the university, the National University in Mexico City in 2014. And between 2008 and 2013, he served as a regional electoral magistrate, including acting as president of the Federal Regional Court under the Federal Electoral Tribunal for 3 years. If you don't know what this means, is Mexico has essentially two judicial systems. One, as we know it in the United States, the courts, the federal courts, all the way up to the Supreme Court. In Mexico, there is a parallel system that exists, but there's also a parallel system purely for electoral issues. And Dr. Nieto was in that system, important figure in that system. He's a researcher in his own right and a professor of law at the Autonomous University in Mexico City, and is the author of several books on important issues in Mexican politics and law. And 9 books is quite an accomplishment. And he's also a member of the National Research System in Mexico. Those books, you can certainly find some of the titles in the program. So please help me welcome our guest today, Dr. Santiago Nieto. Thank you for coming.
Well, good morning. I'm very, very happy, very glad, very exciting, and it's a privilege to me be here in Baker Center and the Rice University. I'm very, very, very proud to be here. I must be very clear with you. My English is terrible, so I must to be talking in Spanish. Quisiera primero agradecer a Tony la invitación.
For the invitation, Rodrigo, Pedro. I want to thank you for the possibility of being here, today with you. It's really very relevant for the government in Mexico and for me personally to be here today and to be able to show you a diagnosis regarding the problems that we have. Oh, the translation channel 4? I would like to start with an explanation. This is a very simple explanation about the unit, the UIF. It becomes a reality because of international agreements that were signed by the Mexican government, in particular the Palermo Convention, the Vienna Convention, and finally, in 2003, the Mérida Convention to fight corruption. In that regard, in Mexico, we're part of the Financial Action Group, AFI, and FARP. Those are acronyms in English. And starting there, it was created. This central unit of intelligence was created. That is the one that undertakes financial intelligence. The global the model we use in Mexico is an administrative model. It's centralized in the basically Ministry of Economy or Finances. And what we do is we receive information from the financial systems, and on the other hand, all the activities in the sector. So this is the organigram. This is what we do. It's a regulating organism of the financial system. We work on money laundering and combating terrorism. Mexico really doesn't have problems with terrorism, but you have to be very clear in this regard. The geopolitical reality makes you work on this so that you can at least be vigilant and be able to control any kind of activity that could have an impact in the U.S. next door. So financing terrorism, it is part of the legal obligation that the financial unit has to take care of. We have other supervising organisms in the state that verify that we follow all the dispositions, all the regulations in terms of money laundering. UIF is part of this group, international group. We are part of GAFI and GAFILAT, and we work with the financial group in the Caribbean also. The position of the current government has been not to just work on money laundering, but also any kind of other crime that is related to this, including human trafficking, laundering of hydrocarbons or stealing hydrocarbons, corruption in general. So the UIF was created in 2004, and starting then, it generated a database that supports the Mérida initiative. So nowadays, we really have a database that is one of the most important ones in the country. We have over 500 million pieces of information that have been reported by the financial sector, talking about the vulnerable activities and in international spaces, like, for instance, the FIUs around the world, including in the U.S. And this UIF, what we do is we receive reports reports about suspicious actions or unusual activities. They have to be relevant. Every activity over $10,000 in a financial activity, and those that do not match the transactional profile of the people involved. We've had cases in which people that are 19, 20 years of age receive millions of dollars in deposits. People that are 100 years old, we always find it suspicious when they all of a sudden have millions of dollars. Somebody does 102, 104, all of a sudden they have an operation for hundreds of millions of dollars. So what we've seen is many people, more people, or legal people, they get like warehouses, abandoned warehouses. They get partners, people that do not have a legal profile. They don't have a corporate profile. All of a sudden they're operating. We see people that have like gas stations, service stations, and we see that their transactional profile does not match the fact that they're partners in an operation or a corporation with international operations or millions of dollars in activities. So the other side to this, any kind of relevant information about money laundering we need to take care of. Mexico has a problem. Mexico's economy doesn't bank. There's a small percentage of the economy that banks. So that makes all the financial operations to happen in cash. And that is a mechanism that obviously generates corruption and money laundering itself. So the proposal here is what are the main international obligations that Mexico has to prevent money laundering and tourism financing. It has to be with these conventions, Vienna, Palermo, Mérida. And with what I would like to start talking about, and I would like to emphasize it, why having a financial intelligence unit in terms of, how does it fit within the policies of this new president of the Republic? What we do at the UIF is we receive and we disseminate information. Gafi, they present a report on Mexico in November 2017. It was published January 2018. And what they said to us is Mexico has several big failures in terms of UIF. We do not provide enough information to the competent authorities in terms of the Attorney General of the Republic. We don't have autonomous cases in terms of money laundering. We do not have we don't have the appropriate mechanisms, and the IRS or the fiscal authorities are not doing the right supervision of those people that are involved in the vulnerable activities. UIF, what is the role that we play as part of this process? UIF has a methodology and the information to shoot right on target. We are able to provide the right information to the ministry so that they can do something about the cases. We have to provide a larger number of cases so that people can be taken to court. And within this context, we have different areas of competency. We have guidelines and we have mechanisms that we can reach agreements of collaboration and cooperation with other areas in the government. But the central issue has to do with exchange of information at a supranational level, and we file and we follow up. Claims when we find something, we have to incorporate people to the list of blocked people. UIF in Mexico, this is what we do. Many times, UIF agencies throughout the world don't have the same authority that we have. We can freeze accounts, for instance, and so that the money cannot continue to be used for criminal purposes. And I would like to give you some more information about that.
Because of the model of processing of information, the organizations that are mandated to need to, UIF has a database, and we have several lists. The organization of foreign assets, the Treasury, from the Treasury in the U.S., the terrorist list, the Mexican list of shell companies, fake operations, etc., and obviously the lists related to indictment of people who following up people who have been indicted or sentenced already. So with this, we generate a risk model. What the mathematicians do is that's neutral. They just generate a model so that certain flags can be raised. There's a score. The closer we are to 10, the higher the possibility of having an issue with money laundering. So all those, there's a cross-link of those lists, the connections of the links, and we can start preparing cases. So they go to the operational analysis sector. We can request information to the National Banking Commission, the National Securities Commission, and then the complaints can be filed with the prosecuting agencies. And then we do a follow-up. How many of the complaints resulted in indictments and sentences? And also, how can we improve the risk model? What do we see there? See age, the risk jurisdiction, the amount of transactions, and basically links to any risk activity. The system has been improving continuously, and it works to a large extent because the financial system provides us with information which is pretty accurate. We have an issue nowadays, for example, with a drug, with fentanyl. This is a global problem. It's a problem that affects the US and Mexico and obviously China, which the geographic area that's generating that type of drug. So the impact is pretty strong. Just one small dose can kill a human, and obviously this is something that falls outside of the common detection mechanisms because of the dangerousness of the substance. And this creates the obligation of incorporating indicators. What did we do with the risk model? We added the word fentanyl. That resulted in 68 cases where we already have reports from the banking system relating to this trafficking of fentanyl. And this allows to develop cases. We can work with the DEA, with the FBI, and other U.S. agencies, so we can have some control and some tracking of people related to fentanyl. Another issue that I mentioned was the inclusion in the list of blocked persons. This is one of the most relevant lists. We have a blocking agreement. This is notified to the supervising entity, which is the National Banking and Securities Commission, and this is distributed 469 financial entities in the country. When that memorandum goes out, these financial entities are prohibited from contracting or from moving those accounts that are suspected of money laundering. We have been recently doing a review of the Jalisco cartel, the new generation, and issues related to the Sinaloa drug cartel. And we detected a number of people who have been denounced, but whose accounts had not been blocked, or the other way around. Their accounts had been blocked, but they were not denounced to or reported to the agencies. So we generated a way of detecting transactions with Sinaloa cartel that have gone through the financial system. As you know, in the trial in New York, where Chapo Guzman ended up being sentenced, there was talk about $12 billion as the profit of the cartel. However, one of the main questions is, where is that money? $12 billion. That's the amount. And the question at the end of the day is, where is that money? In Mexico, really, we're doing is we're following a process of follow-up verification of agents and the 77 relatives of Chapo Guzman. He had 10 children, and there's a network that's basically operating with cash. What have we seen? And this is relevant. One of the public officials who was in charge of the jail, which Chapo Guzman escaped in 2015, he has not gone back to work, but he continues to pay his credit cards off in cash. Obviously, we have filed the complaint. This is a person who is not receiving any income, is not paying any taxes, so how is he supporting himself? So at the end of the day, financial intelligence has to do with algorithms, with generating mathematical risk models, but also a reasonableness standards. Is it reasonable? What we're seeing, the actions we're seeing, is it reasonable or logical for the mother of a governor to be able to buy some of the wetlands in Cancun? That doesn't make sense. I mean, the governor may be a very good son, but he cannot be given his mother part of the wetlands. So, in the end, what happened with that situation? Part of the ecosystem in Cancun was destroyed. This governor is now in jail, but this was a gift that he had given his mother. So, for example, is it reasonable, as I was saying a minute ago, that a company established by a gasoline retail company and have an account overseas in Panama and receive a transfer of $2 million from Odebrecht? Obviously, that's not reasonable. This is part of the corruption model where these people are used as agents. So, by incorporating this list of blocked persons, what we do is we're able to block accounts. These people can appeal. They can go to hearings and appeal and prove that the accounts are being used for illicit purposes, for legal purposes. What we have done in the past is we have blocked institutions and whole companies, but in order to not infringe on the rights of the shareholders and the workers, we end up blocking the accounts that those companies or entities use for their operations when we have suspicions of money laundering. So what's the situation right now? The president of Mexico in his campaign talked about combating corruption. On December 21st, we realized we had a serious problem with the theft of hydrocarbons. In Mexico, 80,000 barrels a day of hydrocarbons were stolen. Those were used basically by crime organizations. And we tried to see how to prevent this. The first strategy we devised was a physical strategy. The Mexican army took over Pemex plants, mainly the ones that were controlled by the union, which allowed this type of abuses. Able to see when the flow was interrupted in one of the pipelines, but instead of blocking that or going to check on that, they would allow hydrocarbons to continue flowing. So 6, 8, or 10 hours went by when hydrocarbons were being extracted from the pipelines, and that was obviously not under anyone's control. Today, we have a loss of 5,000 or 6,000 barrels a day. That's compared to the 80,000 that we were losing every day in December of 2018. Now, fighting drug trafficking, fighting human trafficking, sex trafficking, and finally, fighting against these shell companies. I would like to give you a diagnosis. What's the current situation? I think there are several things that are pretty clear in Mexico about money laundering. We have a Gaffey report where it says there's no indictments, there's no sentencing on that issue of corruption. Then we have the International Transparency Report. Mexico is in position number 138 of 180 countries. We're at 28 points in a scale of 1 to 100, we're closer to Somalia and very far from Finland, Denmark, etc., the most honest countries in the world, according to that index. We're close to Laos, Russia, which is not a democracy. I'm sorry. That's my point of view. But anyway, I've been in public office for 18 years. I have my doubts about the quality of the Russian system. But anyway, the most important point has to do with how did we gradually end up dropping in those indexes? In 2018, we were 103 and within 115, 105 in the legal system, judicial system. Corruption is about 9% of the gross domestic product. The indicators say 6.8%. Our indications are that it grew up in 2017. But there are some positive indications. Mexicans Against Corruption has produced a report this year, 2019, which says that there is a decrease of the perception of corruption. 65% of Mexicans are thinking that corruption is decreasing in the country. I think that's a good indicator. Mexicans Against Corruption is not an entity that's close to the government, so I think that's why this is an indicator that it's worth watching. Now, 92% of the population, all the population uses cash. In general, the population is 37%. So, the current president of Mexico has been questioned because there is a bank, Banco Azteca, that's used to pay for social services for the social network, as we try to develop a more state bank. But I think we need to move the Mexican economy more into the banking system. It continues to be greatly a cash system. And this results in many other issues: crime, kidnapping, corruption, drug trafficking. It's because there's so much cash flow that is incorporated in the system. How does it go into the system? Well, by purchasing jewelry, real estate, cars, etc. That's how the proceeds from this criminal activities gets into the system. But there's also, the money is in the financial system, the government contracts, and a lot of money is moved to shell companies, and then the money is taken out for electoral campaigns, etc. So we have this electoral corruption. So we have an inductive type of mechanics from the crime cartels, crime groups, but also the deduction or a withdrawal from the system from electoral political corruption. This is in reference to the hydrocarbon theft. There's a governor of Veracruz right now who is in jail because of this, being involved in this type of corruption. And I see some relevant issues here. This case, of course, gas stations, there's a lot of cash flow, a lot of payment is received in cash. So in some places, of course, there were cash deposits coming from these gas stations. This made sense. The state had received 172 million at this point, but we ended up finding almost $100 million in cash being deposited in places where the state did not have any retail, any gas stations. This didn't make sense. So what this did is this raised an alarm and allowed the ministry to do an investigation. This was reported. We requested financial information about the accounts that the state and the governor had in the U.S., since many of the proceeds from these operations were being transferred abroad. And going back to the link between hydrocarbon theft and political corruption and organized crime. There is a cartel That's called Santa Rosa de Lima because of its geographical location in the center of the country, in the state of Guanajuato. This is a cartel that used to operate in the state of Celaya, in Salamanca, and this triangle shown here. And they would steal hydrocarbons, and this gave them this financial strength. So they would create shell companies, basically related to cargo transportation. They bought trailers and tractor trailers, and they started moving. And they were cheap for operation because, of course, they didn't spend money on gasoline. They would steal it from Pemex. And this created an unfair competition with other transportation companies in Mexico. The leader of this cartel is now a fugitive, would purchase automobiles, real estate, cattle, etc. And with that, he would also pay the mayors of all these small municipalities to allow him to operate. He would be able to escape every time that the army or the police closed on him. Obviously, he was not the owner of these companies, but his wife, his girlfriend, his children, all these relatives. He also two homes, same, in the same place for his girlfriend and his wife. So he was a pretty brave guy. But anyway, at the end of the day, what happened with this guy is that through work with the federal police and the government of Guanajuato, we were able to detect these companies. The accounts were frozen, the trailers and tractor trailers were seized, and then so we have been able to continue fighting and combating this criminal group. Now, they are fugitives today, but there is still a problem that lingers in the area related to another cartel, the Jalisco. There were mayors of different towns who were helping them. Their accounts were frozen too. And we have been really working in this area. They had a location that was a nightclub where we don't know if this was human trafficking or sex trafficking, but they had 300 young women working. They had on that same street 15 beauty parlors. One of the warehouses, they ended up having a small plane hanging from the ceiling, really just as a way of bragging and showing that the mentality of this criminal group and the impunity. There is political corruption there. Obviously, there's drug trafficking there. There's the hydrocarbon theft. In the end, all of them are linked, and they end up affecting basically human rights. There's another issue that has to do with the unions. We have seen this in large unions like Mexican Petroleum, Pemex. We see this in small unions, but they have the same way of operating. These union leaders establish companies. They become also legal agents for different entities. Like in this case, it was the firemen of Mexico City. They acquire vehicles. 6 months, they paid 32 million pesos to purchase armored vehicles. This person, this leader of a union, would charge the firemen union for their work. He ended up being a candidate for mayor of Mexico City. Through his wife and his mother, he would acquire also real estate properties where he also, when he had a minimal income, this was a person who was making 140,000 pesos a year, and he had real estate purchased for over $10 10 million each, a lot of expenses on credit cards. The problem with credit cards is that in Mexico you can pay them off in cash at 2 a.m. in certain stores. So the problem is that then some of these illegal activities are being financed through credit cards. Ms. Rosario Robles, a relative, was arrested, was basically living on credit cards, which were then paid in cash. Another case, which is very important, has to do with the Autonomous University in the state of Hidalgo. We detected a transaction coming from Switzerland for $151 million. This really raised the flag, having a public university in Mexico receiving $151 million from Switzerland. When we requested information from Switzerland, the argument was that since there's so much political instability in Mexico, the university had decided to take the money out of Mexico. We have been reviewing this, there's no justification. So going back, we ended up seeing that a student leader in 1981, and because of the electoral mechanics of the university and that they vote to pick their authorities, he was in charge of the student body, ended up becoming the Secretary General for the university. He started by taking control of the students, then the union, the university. They reformed the law or amended the law so that he could become the leader for life, which it's not very democratic, let's say. I really doubt that this was a democratic decision on the part of the in the state of Hidalgo. So then some shell companies were created. Really, I think it's important for universities or colleges to have a mechanism to generate income beyond the money they get from the state. I think they have to have this entrepreneurial vision. However, $151 million controlled by this person directly came from companies contracted by the university, which in turn belong to the university. Well, in Spanish we call this corruption. So, this person killed after the accounts were frozen a couple of days later. So we have to be looking into this. We have this companies controlled by relatives of this person. I'm sorry, his son was killed. So we have to really see that there's probably illegal proceeds coming into those accounts. So, corruption. This other case, as the relates to the leader of a university, this the leader of firefighters union, but we find this in several places in the country. What did we do in this case with the fire department? The leader of this union, his accounts were frozen. He reported to the authorities. He's a fugitive nowadays, but at least he's not harming the financial system, the national economy with his operations. Human trafficking. This is another interesting case. We have two types of trafficking. One is the kidnapping of Mexican young girls, all 13 years old. They are sometimes deceived. They are deceived by a boyfriend sometimes to be taken out of those towns. Sometimes they're kidnapped, sometimes they're sold. This happens in Tlaxcala, Oaxaca, and Chiapas. They are then being transferred to agricultural areas north of Mexico. They are forced into prostitution. Sometimes they're sent into large cities. Now, how we detect their financial operations? We look into the way money is transferred, sometimes through Western Union or Electra in Mexico. Oxos is another company in Mexico. There are funds coming from the U.S. to Mexico. Mexico, the money is withdrawn in cash. So this is another model. Here, we have a group of people who would make job offers to young Venezuelan, Colombian, Brazilian women. They would arrive by plane to Mexico, and the trafficker would take their passport away, tell them they had to pay for their airfare, so they would force them into prostitution. They would take their pictures, have naked pictures, upload them on a web page. They also were forced to pay for the web page, and customers would hire them through the web page. Payment was made in cash. Would provide the cash to the pimp or the trafficker, or the money maybe was paid into the accounts of shell companies. This was a model. These shell companies used the money to pay wages or salaries to the people in charge of guarding or quote-unquote protecting these women or the trafficker. Now, this money was then used by the dealer or the trafficker to buy Bitcoin or other instruments, other securities that we have in Mexico nowadays with the virtual assets platforms. There's still no regulation from the Bank of Mexico, so the oversight is very limited. And also, money is transferred to the U.S., to Panama, as well as used to acquire real estate. How did we find this person? There were 3 warrants for his arrest in Mexico City, but nobody was able to locate him. The Attorney General of Mexico City gave us information. An activist, Rocio Orozco, who fights against human trafficking, gave us information. We simply did a query with his name in our database. We saw he was about to acquire real estate in Playa del Carmen, half an hour south of Cancun. Information was given to the federal police. Federal police conducted surveillance, waited for him, and arrested him. Asked to identify himself, he showed a fake voter's ID. He was asked to exit his vehicle. The police said, well, you're not so-and-so, you're this person. And the police said, well, policeman asked for a bribe. He offered a bribe to the policeman. He was taken, handcuffed, and he was taken to the jail where he's currently being detained. He was tricked, yes, of course. Well, but I think in this case is warranted. What happened with this guy? It is estimated that 2,000 women were on his webpage between 2001 and 2017. This doesn't mean that all these women were trafficked, but I mean, what's the percentage of these women who were actually trafficked? We don't want to have any percentage. So we need to work with the victims, return them to their countries of origin. But in the end, reparations for a life that has been damaged by this trafficking, the damage is permanent. This guy was living in a tourist area of the Mexican Republic in the Mayan Riviera and profiting from this trafficking. So how do we work? How can financial intelligence support the mechanism to fight this crime related to drug trafficking and money laundering?
This is a network of shell companies. We see them in several cases. There's one case that links the government of Venezuela, for instance, the stepsons of Nicolás Maduro, and also, I mean, the accusation was already made, and this is a case in which The government of Venezuela was sending resources to Hong Kong. They had a company they created there. There was an affiliated company in Mexico. That company received funds from Hong Kong, and they hired other companies in Mexico to purchase food. They were low nutritional value food. Some of them were rotten in bad shape. They were taken to Veracruz and in containers that were delivered to Venezuela, and they were resold then at an extremely high price to clubs. Those were the local committees for production of local supply. So what was it really that the Maduro government was doing? They were controlling politically. They were generating hunger due to all the, lack of resources and the problems in Venezuela, and the way to controlling them was to provide them with these boxes of food items. Of course, the funds were coming from money laundering. They were sold at an expensive price, and they were then taken to either Turkey or Hong Kong. They were taken to Spain, and among other geographic areas. So what we did, this is something that we did with FinCEN, with the Treasury in the United States. And so what we did is we blocked in Mexico 19 companies that were working with this, both companies and individuals. And there were 3 accusations for the Attorney General in terms of money laundering because of this. And it is incredible. Venezuela obviously is not a democracy, but it is incredible that they're using hunger against their own citizens, their own people, so that they can stay in power. That is something that is immoral. It's illegal, it's immoral, it's unethical, etc., etc. So. Well, of course, now that we've frozen their accounts, the Mexican companies are saying that they were just doing the trading, that they were not involved. Just in case, to be on the safe side, we froze every account. And I think it has to do with the responsibility. I mean, if you're selling low-quality products, bad products, or you're selling expired products, you're responsible for that. So nowadays, it's still in the AG's hands, and we're working in international collaboration on this. This case is Mexvel, Mexico, Venezuela. This has to do with Grupo Lima. This has to do with operations in the entire Latin America, everything that has to do with the government of Mr. Maduro. So obviously, it's a violation of fundamental human rights and their citizens' rights. And this is an issue of shell companies. This is another one. Money ends up going to Israel, the United States, and the companies in red on the bottom are those companies that were in charge of laundering money. And for these crime organizations, and then they would take them up to these other companies that were operating the right way. But so, what are we doing now? And these are the statistics to today. This is information to August the 15th. We have blocked 129 entities or people, total number of people blocked, 601. If we add third parties and people that were directly blocked in numbers, we have over 3 billion pesos, a little bit over $38 million. 8 euros is not that important. Very few people launder euros in Mexico. But what's interesting about these numbers, for instance, there is Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. There was just, they dispatch funds to a residential area in Guadalajara, one of the richest municipalities or areas in Guadalajara. This is something that they didn't register fiscally. But this is obviously people that were not paying taxes, and they were promoting, funds for the leaders of the for the Cartel Jalisco. And some other members of the cartel Sinaloa also. When we froze their accounts, just the owner had an account with $2 million himself, the owner of the dispatch. So we froze that account. Till today, he has not come forward to claim the money. What does that mean? Obviously, these are funds that have an illicit or illegal source. So somebody else that was taken out of, that was involved in this that was taken out of the court. Somebody else had 50 million pesos in his accounts, for instance. And these are funds that they couldn't explain where they came from. So the judges and the federal magistrates and the ministers can only receive the funds that they perceive as part of their salary. This person ended up having 26 million pesos that they could justify, but 50 million pesos they couldn't justify. So this is obviously somebody else that was fired. And we do have information about several of their colleagues that, basically they were connected to the main leaders of the Cartel Jalisco. So Cartel Jalisco had two ways of doing this. They had the purchase, they bought things, and the other strategy they used was to terrorize people. So they were basically influencing the state of Jalisco, and they were, that's the way they were getting away with this. So there was another case. There is another individual, El Sapo, who was a leader in Puerto Vallarta, also drug trafficking, another cartel. We found several million pesos in his accounts also. And again, very violent individual. And so what is the point of view that we take here? Basically, even if the attorney generals or the DAs, even if they take out 10 drug traffickers out of the street, or, I don't know, 100 people who just sell drugs on the street, this is going to continue growing regardless. It's going to continue growing at the national level. Mexico, unfortunately, is a producing country. We produce drugs. We sell drugs. So we also have to put that on the table. We have to see that very clearly. And that's why I think that the way for us to attack organized crime has to be through blocking their accounts. They will have the possibility, of course, to legally defend their rights to the accounts. But when there's this presumption that this is money that proceeds of illegal dealings, we need to act. What happens, for instance, this hacking? What happened in Guanajuato, for instance? I don't know if I mentioned this before. There was this hacking in Guanajuato. What were they purchasing with the money? Ferraris, Camaros, Lamborghinis, luxury vehicles. So what do we see with the drug traffickers? In many occasions, they start pawning their jewelry or expensive things. Maybe they stole them. Maybe they took them from people's homes and they're exchanging them for cash. Maybe they purchased them. And if they bought them, they take them to the pawn shop once they don't have enough cash flow. Whatever happens, we see how money is introduced into the financial system via cars, vehicles, art pieces, jewelry, even though art may not be the biggest thing in Mexico. But we see the art piece in corruption, political corruption mostly. So we block the accounts. The Supreme Court, I don't quite agree with this, but we have to follow what they do. We're not going to argue with them. But basically, the Supreme Court says that if the reason for the block is international, that is okay and that is constitutional. But if it's based on a national investigation only, that is not constitutional. I don't like that. I don't agree with it. But we are generating a legal reform process in Congress so that the Supreme Court doesn't have this objection anymore, this constitutional objection. Because what the Supreme Court is saying is that there has to be a right. It should be a legal right, and it shouldn't be just it shouldn't be below the law. We need to make it a law so that we don't have any exceptions to it. So what we do is we block the funds first, and then we go to court and we deal with the legal issues. So we are dealing now with millions of dollars that were in the hands of criminals, and nowadays they're frozen. So who keeps the funds right now? The banks keep the funds right now. So the interest paid on this are also in the hands of the banks right now. So what we need to do is what the Colombians did. I think Colombia and the U.S. are the big examples of what you should do when you're attacking the problem of the drug trafficking and those funds. What they did is something that works really well. They changed the constitution. They pointed out that the original property belonged to the state, and when somebody couldn't justify where they had acquired an asset, funds or property, the state recovers the property. We have not moved forward in Mexico. It's one of the big things that we have pending. We have to do it. I think of El Chapo when I think this, but I also think of Cartel Jalisco and all the other political corruption issues. And at the end of the day, that's what we need to do. I think it's a symbol. I was talking about corruption a minute ago and why Mexico occupied this space. 138 out of 180 countries analyzed by Transparency International. And why Brazil or Peru, that are similar countries, culturally they're similar countries, why are they in 96? Why are we so behind? Why are we 40 places below them? I think we're 40 places below them because of a last name, a German last name, somebody that went to Brazil at the end of the 19th century, Odebrecht. What happened with Odebrecht in Mexico? Nothing happened in Mexico with it, and that was the problem. And I was talking to some people, there were people that were arrested in Latin America, in Peru, in Brazil, ex-presidents, Secretary of States in Colombia. There were very important big cases, and there were only 2 countries where nothing happened with Odebrecht, and that was Venezuela and Mexico. And the joke was that somebody told me is that in Mexico, public officers never fall. And I said, well, no, we had 2. We had the electoral, DA, and yeah, it was because of the Odebrecht case. But at the end of the day, Mr. Lozoya is in jail right now. He received $16 million through different deposits. I'm sorry, he's not arrested yet. He has been indicted, but he has fled, and there's a warrant for his arrest, and all his accounts in Mexico are frozen. So I think that we have taken very important steps in very few months, and the message is zero tolerance to corruption, to impunity, which is the instruction that I have from the president. The number of charges, we have 111 charges. People charged 492, individuals 269, corporations 208, public officers 15. I mean, we've gone beyond what our initial goal was, and these are the amounts. We're talking about deposits over $1.5 billion pesos. I'm sorry, in dollars. Out of this, just 111 charges. So what this means to us is that money laundering is really in the 50 billion range right now. And this is just the charges that the UIF has taken care of through their different mechanisms for generation of cases. I insist euros are not reflective of what's going on. There are some mistakes there, but there is very little money laundering in euros, 117 million euros compared to amount in dollars or the amount in pesos. So we're talking about 169 billion pesos. Okay. Well, how we have charged 57 authorities. This is linked with the National Defense Secretary. There was a case of public officers in the Secretary of Defense. Again, they had 150 million pesos in their accounts. A captain in the army, why would they have that kind of money? There's a Secretary of Public Function. If it is something that had to do with electoral crimes, magistrates that all of a sudden have a lot of money in their account, the Attorney General of the state of Guanajuato, and the Attorney General of the Federation. And I would like to close now this presentation on this note. A little bit what we're proposing here is to have an introspective vision of what is the foundation of the UIF. The types of cases that we're dealing with, and evidently we have to close with a prospective view. Where are we going from here? And I believe that First of all, we have to recover the trust. People have to trust their institutions. The institutions have to work the way they were designed. For many years, we saw that combating corruption was not working. We need to think of why it wasn't working. One of the elements of why the system didn't work is because the UIF was not part of the anti-corruption effort. Why wasn't it part? Because Peña Nieto decided that it shouldn't be part. Eduardo Jorge in Mexican Transparency told me that he presented the idea to Peña Nieto. The president at the time said no. The second thing here, and this is important, happens when the institutions are not legitimate. The trust disappears or weakens, the institutional strength disappears, and then there is this network of impunity. And we need we need to have solutions beyond the person who signed the document. We need to go to the secretaries of state. We need judgments. I was a DA for a long time. It was a great phase of my life, and I think that what we need to do at the Attorney General's office, we need to make sure that people whistleblow, that they tell their superiors what's going on when they see something is going on. They don't need to sign anything, but those superiors are normally the ones that are responsible for taking those resources. We have some 800 million pesos, for instance, that have been taken away. In Cerrato, we are seeing federal territories that were being sold to these shell companies, and then they were being bought by a cousin of ex-President Peña Nieto. It's strange, to say the least. But what we see is that how the unit was used as a means of political attack. Ricardo Anaya, who was a presidential candidate, was accused of money laundering by the UIF at the time. Nothing was ever proven, but then they showed a video of him with his attorney at the Attorney General's office. I don't think this is correct. That's not what we're supposed to do. What we need to do is repurpose, and change the ethical institutional position of the UIF. And Mexico now has an opportunity for change. There is a president now that is honest, austere, and believe me, he is. And he has a very different way of doing things. And I don't know if it's good fortune or bad fortune. I do have to sit at the national security meetings, and that means you have to be there at 5:30 in the morning every day at the National Palace to meet with the president. So the first time they called me, they said, well, the meeting is at 6 a.m. I got there at 5:55. The door is closed. I go into the room, and I see that the president is there with all the secretaries of state, and there's an empty chair in the back, and I realized that was my empty chair, so I had to walk in front of everybody while everybody is looking at me, and because I was late. And the next day I was there at 5:30 in the morning, and they're not going to do that to me again. But it's a possibility now. We can change things. This is Mexicans Against Corruption. Mexicans Against Corruption, I think it's very important. The work that they're doing is very important. We're against corruption. There were accusations against Rato and other people. So Claudio González, and the president are not friendly, so to speak. But what they're doing is very important. Mexicans Against Corruption, they help with the perception that we're combating corruption in the country. And this is something that we need to strengthen in the country. And of course, we need judgments, and we need exemplary judgments, and we need cases that are emblematic of what's going on, relevant cases, the case that can send a message that we are fighting impunity and that we are fighting corruption. And why these mobilizations? Why, a transference of what, 10 million euros or $10 million? It's rare that a public servant that makes what they make in Mexico, that all of a sudden they have access to that kind of money, that kind of cash. So
What do we need? We need indictments, we need judgments, we need more accounts frozen, we need a systematic job with organizations of the civil society, with academia, and again, to recover the trust in Mexican institutions, rebuild the trust. So I would like to close by saying this. At the end of the day, I think that Mexico is a democratic system. We went from an hegemonic, a single-party system pretty much, to a system where we have now a number of political parties, have solid electoral institutions. There's a division of powers. And I think Mexican institutions have been strengthening through these last 25 years. But the big challenge does not relate to electoral democracy nowadays. It has to be with substantive democracy, with combating the lack of security, combating corruption and impunity. So we need to quality of our democracy. And it's not just through the electoral process. We need to improve mechanisms so that really the citizens are the ones making decisions and not criminal groups that at this time are deciding who's going to be the treasurer of a municipality in Michoacán, or who will be the director of public works or the chief of police in some municipalities in the state of Tamaulipas. So I think this is a job that has to be done jointly with the American government. I'm sure of that. There's no way we can disconnect from each other. Mexico is part of the global context. We have to strengthen the values of democracy and of the free market. And I think it can be done even from a left-leaning government. It can be done by generating public policies that respect the free market and democracy, and that work in the context of improving social conditions. Mexico has about 60 million people who live in some degree of poverty, so we need to prevent this from becoming the breeding ground or attitudes and situations that go against our society. I'm sorry if I talk too much, so I apologize to all of you for that, but I'm at your disposal. I'm very thankful and very pleased to be here today. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Nieto, Santiago, for joining us today. We have a few minutes for Q&A. I think, just in a brief observation on Santiago's remarks, indeed, I think that the Mexican electorate gave a mandate to President López Obrador to fight corruption. That's central, because by fighting corruption, you fight crime, you fight embezzlement of public funds, and all the kinds of things that deny Mexico that graduation to a higher level of democracy and a higher level of development. There are political disagreements in Mexico. There are political parties that agree, certainly on the goals, fighting corruption. Maybe the tactics and the strategies there are differences in them. But I think clearly this administration is dedicated to fighting corruption, and in that mandate, I think Dr. Nieto is central because it is all about following the money trail. It's about denying crime and corrupt functionaries the ability to use the funds that they took from the Mexican people. And I think that's an important route to get Mexico to the next level. So we'll take questions from the audience now, and then Santiago will have a chance to answer.
Please wait for the mic to come around so that they can translate the question for
yes.
Thank you.
We have two microphones, right? Yes. There's one right there at the back. And then raise your hand, and I'll start prepping up the next question. Here and then here.
Yes, Transparency International ranked Mexico like 32nd in 1994, now it's like you said, 138. Do you think that's a good goal to judge the administration's progress on this important topic?
La pregunta sería que si considero que ha habido un progreso.
Question whether if I deem there's been some progress with the current administration in combating money laundering in particular.
I think what he's asking is if do you want to see improvement in the ranking? Is that your benchmark to see an improvement in corruption?
Instead of 138,
Yes.
coming down.
Yes, I think we can change our position in the global view or review by international transparency. Sí, yo creo que acciones.
I think that
Eso es una pregunta muy importante.
that's a very important question.
Transparencia Internacional se mueve a partir de
Very
percepciones
international
y con dos vías. La vía
on
de
perceptions
la encuesta
through
a la
two
ciudadanía
means,
y por otro lado, la vía de los
surveys
expertos.
of the
Yo
citizenry
creo que,
and also. Are you
sí,
listening in
vamos
English? Can
a
you hear?
mejorar
Okay.
nuestro
And I think
nivel,
we will
para el año
improve
2019, pero
our ranking
requerimos otro
in
elemento
2019,
importante, que es el
but there's another
cumplimiento con los
important
indicadores
element that
de
we need to
transparencia internacional y en general
comply
de los
with, is the
indicadores
complying with the
internacionales.
international
¿Qué está
indicators,
faltando, por
all the
ejemplo?
indexes. What's lacking? For example,
eliminar todas las adjudicaciones directas.
eliminating
México
all
sigue haciendo
the
adjudicaciones
direct
directas.
awarding
Por
of
ejemplo,
contracts.
cuando
Mexico
se compraron las
continues to
pipas
do
para
that.
el combate al robo
For
de
example,
hidrocarburos.
when
Vinieron aquí a Estados
pipes
Unidos a
or
comprar
pipelines were
pipas
purchased
para efecto de llevar
in order to fight hydrocarbon
llevarlas
theft,
a México y
they
poder
were bought
transportar
here
el
in the
hidrocarburo
U.S.,
para no abrir los ductos.
brought to Mexico,
¿Y qué implicó eso?
so
Una
that
adjudicación directa.
we had these pipes that couldn't be opened.
Nosotros
But that was a
necesitamos cambiar esa
direct
mecánica
award,
para
direct
que
contract.
ese indicador
We need
en
to
particular
change that mechanism so that that
cubramos.
particular
Porque
indicator
siempre que hay
is
una adjudicación directa
responded to.
que no
Because
se
every
liciten
time that there is a
públicamente
direct
las
award
contrataciones
and no
gubernamentales,
public
hay un
bidding
riesgo de
of
corrupción.
government contracts, there's a risk of
Entonces,
corruption.
yo
So
estoy convencido
I am
de que
convinced
López Obrador es un
that
gobernante honesto,
Lopez Obrador is
que
an
la oficial
honest
mayor de Hacienda
official,
es una
honest
persona
president,
honesta.
that the person in charge of the Ministry of Economy is an honest person.
El
And
presidente está pensando
the president
en su sitio en la historia.
is thinking
no en
about
hacer
his place in history and not in doing business. In contrast with the prior government, and I apologize for this. I hope I don't hurt any feelings, but I think President Peña Nieto
Creo que
did not understand that he didn't understand. I think,
la cabeza le servía para
but no,
peinarse.
that he didn't know. His head was good for combing his hair only. He did not have a vision, a clear vision of the issues and the reality of the country. And nowadays, you see him with his girlfriend, just taking selfies in Brussels, dancing like he's a 15-year-old. So I think that what did they do? Well, they just produced corruption, because this is a group that remained in power for too long. They started governing the state of Mexico in 2005. From there, he went on to the candidate for president. So it was like 13 years, uninterrupted years of exercising power without control. And at the end of the day, if there's no institutional means to control that excess, that power, we ended up the way we did. And so I think there are things we will be able to do. But I think that the more negative judgments we have, the more public officials end up in jail, that'll be important. And I'll give you an example. The university that I talked about, the university is a person who wants to be a candidate for the governorship from the Morena State Party. And I think that would be a mistake to let him do that. We have found cases, a delegate in Jalisco with very strange connections, and we do need to prevent these people from that party from Morena to reaching power.
Buenos días.
Good morning. I would like to know your opinion about corruption in Veracruz. The former governor is now in jail for 9 years. What will happen to his wife, who remained in Great Britain? It's a very unfortunate case, the whole of it. Let me tell you, as a prosecutor, I issued an arrest warrant to Mr. Javier Duarte for an electoral crime. It was a small crime. There was no prison term. They would have had to pay a fine only. But I was always surprised by this Javier Duarte. His father died in the 1985 earthquake, so he became an orphan very young. He was always taken care of by relatives. The people who know him say that he's a very charming guy. Would tell jokes to the former governor. He became an administrative official. I don't think telling jokes is a talent that you need for that, but that's how he got that position. He went for postgraduate work in Spain, and he was the one who was in charge of all the business affairs of this governor of Veracruz, not Duarte, but his predecessor. This governor ended up winning the lottery twice. That's strange. I think now, looking at this from the optics of money laundering, I think that was the mechanism. He said he had won the lottery in order to justify the cash income. I just found another case of a current national senator who an inheritance from his mother. His mother died in January. The 10 million pesos that he inherited reappeared in June. That doesn't make sense. Where was that money for 6 months? But again, going back to the case of Duarte, the governor. Duarte, approximately, he diverted 30 million pesos, allegedly. The most serious cases were, first of all, to have substituted chemotherapy medication for children, selling positions to crime groups. I mean, the loss of human life in Veracruz resulting from this is appalling. And the lack of economic development. You could see that in Puebla, the city of Puebla, there was a lot of economic development, nothing in the neighboring city of Veracruz. I don't know what happened in Puebla as far as corruption, but at least you could see some economic growth. The issues that the PGR, the Attorney General's office at the time of Dr. Cervantes, they opened a case for corruption and bribing, money laundering, and organized crime. But Dr. Cervantes left his position. Alberto Elias Beltran took over. We're not good friends, I need to say that too. And Elias Beltran, now in charge, at that time, the UIF, the Financial Investigation Units, 2018, we sent a brief to the Attorney General so that the crime would be reindicted, removing the charges for organized crime. This was taken to the court, and this was to that charge, organized crime, and that, of course, would result in a reduced penalty. 2 years have gone by, and 2 more years, maybe he will have to stay in jail until he can become a free man again. Because of this complicity, I guess, between the UIF and the Attorney General. So what do we need to do? I think we need to develop other cases, other corruption cases. We need to document those cases, take them to the courts, so that other penalties are imposed. And obviously, this relates to family too. We cannot put the wife in jail because of what her husband has done, but I think we can seize his assets, her assets. And this woman, the wife of the former governor, continues to live in London in a pretty nice residential area. And the question is, how is she supporting herself? So I think that's the next step. We cannot tie knots, because the worst thing that can happen to the Mexico judicial system, the Mexican pursuit of justice, is that maybe 2 years from now, Mr. Duarte will come out of jail and there will be no consequence related to his assets.
Thank you for being with us. A question that has to do with Mexican people that come to do business in Houston. It's a very attractive place. They come here and they buy a home or, legal businesses. But is there a mechanism that, when somebody comes here for business, is there a system for us to verify, to make sure that they're not on the blacklist, they're not blocked? I mean, to trust them? Well, that is a great question, and that is a great topic. And I think this is something that we need to think through. It has to be resolved in the near future. Nowadays, to tell you the truth, the lists become public for the country, but for the financial system. This is information that goes to the banks. The law forbids for us to make those lists public. The people who've been blocked, they cannot be published, for instance. There's always a presumption of innocence, of course. That doesn't happen with, the people who do not, pay their taxes, the income tax. I mean, that's public, and you can look at those lists. But I think that's worth exploring as a mechanism to, protect your investments for the people that are doing this kind of transactions. Who will have information access? FinCEN here in the U.S. But I think that we need to improve the mechanisms for communication for, different business groups, so that automatically you would have a report. We're working with Compex for Mexico right now, and this is something that we need to do even more. So right now what we're creating is a database, and as you know, somebody that sells cars or sells homes, somebody can just enter a name into the system, the UIF system, and then we will be able to reply whether that's a person politically exposed or not. I think it would be worth generating a system, perhaps not making the whole list public or publishing it, but if somebody wants to consult and see if somebody is on the list of blocked people, you can just go to a binary system and say, yes, they're blocked, no, they're not blocked. If they're not blocked, then you can go ahead and, do any kind of commercial transaction with them. Thank you so much for the presentation today. One question, the opposite question. We are worried here in our country that our president sometimes is thinking that the government, can be sold. And I would like to hear your opinion, your impression of the administration here, the DA, your impression of the DA, of Treasury, and other parts of the government. Do you see the problem as a perception of the president himself, or do you see a problem with the impression of the perception of the other entities? Are you still operating as if you trusted those other institutions? My perception, I'm going to be honest. I think that important efforts are being made to generate trust between the government of the U.S. and the government of Mexico, regardless of their presidents, so to speak. I see the ambassador. And as a symbol, the ambassador of the U.S. in Mexico, they come, they present their credentials. Then after that, they go to the Guadalupe Cathedral, the Basilica. And this is important for the people of Mexico. And as his first appointment in Mexico, he came and he quoted Benito Juarez, who was a contemporary to Abraham Lincoln. And that was a message for the government. Benito Juarez is a message for the government. The Virgin of Guadalupe is a message for the people of Mexico. So I see that they are convinced that you need to generate a relationship of trust. I work very well with the DEA. I work very well with the FBI. I work very well with the Treasury Department. So there is information flow, the information that we need to get to fight political corruption, and we give them what they need. For instance, to fight drug traffic. So there's a lot of exchange of information. We have task forces together so that we work on specific cases together. We've done joint investigations, like the one in Venezuela, for instance. If you ask me, I'm really worried about Venezuela and what's happening over there. We really need to look at what's happening in Venezuela, violations of human rights and democratic system itself. So the President Trump is not a fan of Mexico, but what we need is to generate trust that the institutions are changing. And the meeting that we had yesterday with the ambassador, he said something that I thought was important. He said that the relationship with Mexico was good during the prior administration, but it's even better now. Things are evolving, and I insist this is at the level of the embassies, but I think the SOFAC lists are a good exercise. What we do with these lists is we work with OFAC, we give them information, they get our information, and we generate. It's not a consensual list, but it's it's detailed. It's a joint project so that we can block companies or agents who have been involved in corruption. And together, jointly, again, we were able to take out an ex-governor of Nayarit. The stepdaughters, Maduro's stepdaughters, were part of the list the last time. So I think those are important cases. And of course, the government of Mexico has a non-intervention position as far as Venezuela goes. But our position and the president's position is if there are crimes that are being committed by Venezuela and Mexico, we will fight those. And this is something that we're doing along with the U.S.
In the next conversation now to Mexico. Thank you. Very difficult.